history began. Oops. I gotta click this real quick, you guys. It begins in the early 90s when I leave my boyhood home of Traverse City to attend school at Michigan State University in the city of East Lansing. And back then, come on. Okay. Well, looks like that beginning of the recording froze me up, you guys. Hold on a second. Well, I guess I'm going to use my mouse to click it from here on out. Back then, I had a lot more hair. And one of my favorite things to do in my college years, living in East Lansing, was drive to the city of Detroit to take in the city's burgeoning house and techno music scenes that were really exploding at that time. And as a bright-eyed youth coming from Traverse City, seeing these epic constructions for the first time, I was really struck by the difference between this and my hometown. On one of these excursions to Detroit in 1993, I ran across a friend of mine that I grew up with in Traverse City, Jay Perlich, actually, Andy. And he was engaged in an architectural program at the University of Detroit, and he recommended to me that I check out the Guardian Building, a place that I'd never heard of up until he told me about it. And my first visit here was absolutely a watershed moment that greatly increased my interest in the city and the state's architectural history. A few months later, in February of 1994, I purchased from my mother a book entitled Buildings of Michigan by a former state historic preservation officer by the name of Catherine Bishop Eckert. And I immediately borrowed the book from my mother and have yet to return it. So happy birthday, Mom. Throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, and to this day, when I drive around the state of Michigan, I keep this book on my lap or in the passenger seat. Anytime I get a chance, I will make a detour into the small towns that Eckert covers in the book to see what they've got to offer architecturally. This is really my first introduction into formal architectural history studies, and it's the first place I'm exposed to the name of Corrado Carducci, who ends up becoming really important to my development as an architectural historian. We're going to fast forward here now to March 2008, and at this point, I'm living in Hamtramck, and I get my first digital camera. The very first thing I do is start driving around Detroit, taking pictures of all my favorite buildings and posting architectural histories on Facebook. And it only took a few months of doing this for a lot of my friends to tell me, Dale, you need a better venue through which you show off your architectural history studies. So it took a little bit while, but a couple years more down the road, I launched a website called I Love Detroit, Michigan that I still publish to this day. And I started writing about architectural history there. And it only took a few months of writing about it there for strangers to start contacting me, wanting to talk more about the subjects I was covering. They'd offer corrections or additional insights. One of the people that I met is a guy named Einar Ikabaran. He lives in suburban Phoenix, and he's Icelandic by descent, which accounts for his slightly uncommon first name there. And over a few months of corresponding with Einar, he eventually revealed to me that in the 1990s, he hunted down a son of Corrado Carducci. This is an Italian-American architectural sculptor that worked in Detroit from the 20s to the 80s. And that Carducci's son, in his 80s, gave him permission to photocopy his dad's original studio ledgers, as well as his original studio scrapbook that contained over 700 images of sculpture he created over his decades in Detroit. Well, once Einar told me about these ledgers, the gears of my brain immediately started clicking, and I said to myself, I want to write a book about this subject. And this was around 2013. I didn't get the book out until 2020. There were quite a few bumps in the road along the way, but it was the process of writing this book that probably gave me my highest degree of expertise in the area of architectural history. And in the 2 years after writing the Corrado Carducci book, I followed it up with a book about stained glass in New Orleans and a book about the local architect, Albert Kahn. Well, you can write down the website real quick if you have any interest in purchasing. I've also got it available at a $5 discount tonight for anybody who's interested. So now that you know how I attained my expertise in the field, let's talk about the architecturally significant performance spaces in Metro Detroit. And we are going to start tonight with Harmony Hall. This is in the Harmony Park section of Detroit. And this is built in the last decade of the 19th century. And this is a really super important construction that's in great shape today because it's been taken care of well over the years. But what makes it really important for the purposes of our discussion tonight is that this is one of the first venues built in Detroit where European artists who came to town were starting to think of Detroit as a destination city when they went on an American tour. So these articles from the Detroit Free Press from the last decade of the 19th century show people that aren't as famous as Beethoven and Mozart, but these are all really super highly regarded classical musicians of their time. And their careers go far enough into the 20th century that if you go on YouTube and look for a recording of any of these three, you're going to find quite a few to choose from. So all very super successful musicians, successful enough that they're coming to do American tours from Europe and considering Detroit a place worth stopping. And that's really why I wrote this lecture about music venues in Detroit, because since the 1890s, we've been a world leader in the dissemination of popular culture, especially when it comes to live music. As far as my own personal experience here, I remember once in the 2000s, I saw a DJ play here, but they don't really have an active schedule of live music performances like so many of the other venues we're going to talk about tonight. Here's one that probably a lot more of you have heard of, St. Andrew's Hall. This is right downtown on Congress Street. And this is originally built as a building where a fraternal organization, the St. Andrews Society, where they have their meetings and their community activities. And they hold on to this hall until the late 1970s and use it for those purposes. It doesn't get started as a live music venue until about 81. A couple theater troupes own it from about 79 to 81. Well, a lot of people, they associate St. Andrew's Hall with underground music and stuff that isn't really world famous yet. And that is still the reputation it has today. But in the first few years they were open, their lineup was full of huge hit makers. Pretty much everyone on this list had a top 10, if not #1 hit on the top 40 in the first half of the 1980s. Come On Eileen by Dexys Midnight Runners, Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, She Blinded Me with Science by Thomas Dolby. And a lot of people are really surprised to find out this is how St. Andrews got started as a live venue, because they're not bringing anybody that's this huge anymore. And more power to them. It's really cool that they bring in underground. Hi, Amanda. An underground group. But back when they first got started, they were definitely bringing hit makers. As far as my own experience here goes, I've been to a ton of concerts here, but I've been to about 3,000 concerts or live music performances over the course of my life. And what I like to brag about the most is when I see an act before they get famous. And here in 1995, I saw the band 311 perform with opening act No Doubt featuring Gwen Stefani, and this is about 6 weeks before they have their first #1 hit, I'm Just a Girl. So definitely one of my favorite shows to brag about. I'm not even a huge No Doubt fan, but I love it when I see them before they get famous. Let's move on now to the Packard plant, which many people are shocked and surprised to learn is a legendary live music performance venue in Detroit. And who can imagine how an old, blown out, blighted auto factory could be home to so much great music, but it is. And, the Packard plant is a big part of the reason why I started coming to Detroit regularly. In 1993, one of my friends dragged me to an event here called a rave. I'd never been to one before. I'd never heard of the artist playing, and I had no idea of the Packard plant's architectural historical significance. But when I got there that night, I had pretty much a religious experience, and I became a huge techno music fan that I still am to this day. But for about 20 years, well, I did activities like this all the time. Although Detroit's scene kind of transited to legal venues and clubs. Back in the 90s, however, these were semi-legal events, let's call them. And it wasn't really common for these type of events to have the address published right in the flyer. A lot of times you wouldn't find out about the address until the night of the event because there was a certain air of secrecy. So it's actually kind of rare to have the address of a rave event printed on the flyer like this. This is the front and the back, 3 different flyers, just so you know. I want you guys to pay special attention. Oh, I'm walking away from my spot, aren't I? This flyer right here are 4 artists this night. are Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, Eddie Folks, and Derek May. And they're pretty much the absolute core of the inventors of techno music in Detroit, the sound that got exported all over the world. So for that reason, this is a really legendary live music venue. Oh, so look, I'm going backwards. Oh, here we go, I got it. That's always active through a large part of the 90s. When people would show up at an event like this back in the day, it was not to take pictures of architectural details. But luckily, I have a lot of friends that were ensconced in this scene to this day, and one of them who lives in Grand Rapids now shared me this photo of the Packard plant in a post-party, with a post-party look in the 1990s. He's not sure what party it was at, but that party definitely happened there before the picture was taken. Let's move on to the Garden Theater now. There's only going to be 2 entries in my lecture that weren't built as theaters. The Packard plant was the first. There's another one coming up, but let's get back to more traditional theaters here. This is the Garden Theater, built in 1912, and unfortunately, over the years, it's lost its pediment and its cornice decorations there. So it's much more plain looking now, but it's still a really cool building, in my opinion, that's been renovated recently. So it's been hosting concerts recently. Also, I don't have information about what they did in opening night here, but in the first full year of their opening, they did host an event called the Annual Frolic of the Players Club. Now, the Players Club is a really important group of guys in Detroit that have been putting on plays at their clubhouse that was built in the late 20s for over 100 years in Detroit. But before they built their clubhouse, they would have their annual frolic at a different theater around town. And this is their very first frolic. And just to give you an idea of how influential the guys in this group are, here's one named Harrington Walker here. He's the son of Hiram Walker, the whiskey maker. And then we got Colburn Standish right here. He's a direct descendant of Miles Standish, the captain of the Mayflower. And this is a fact that's reiterated in newspaper accounts of the day whenever he ends up in the news over the course of his life. So this is a really important first frolic, and I was only able to learn that it was their first frolic when I actually talked to a historian from the Players Club who informed me of that fact. I went backwards again. As far as my own experience here goes, oh, I got to talk about the burlesque era first. We can't forget about this. These are really super representative of exactly what the American burlesque era in the 50s was like. And what I find really fascinating about these advertisements is that in the present day, depending on who you're talking to, this kind of imagery can be interpreted in a spectrum that goes all the way from exploitative to empowering. And I find that really interesting that there can be such disparate opinions about this kind of imagery. As far as my own experience here goes, in 2018, I was able to see Sixto Rodriguez, who's quite an old guy and probably won't be with us much longer, unfortunately. But Sixto is a Detroit legend who recorded for Motown, but didn't achieve fame in the United States, but achieved massive fame in South Africa in the 60s and 70s, unbeknownst to him. And that's what this film dramatizes. His family's discovery that, oh, wow, I'm actually famous in South Africa. And this movie was really well received by the critics and won the Academy Award documentary, Best Documentary in 2012 there. Highly recommended if you guys haven't seen it. Right across the street, just a tiny bit further north from the Garden Theater, is the Majestic Theater. And you guys probably don't recognize it from this ad here because it's changed a lot over the years. But this was its original appearance when it opened in 1915. Oh, I failed to mention also that this theater and the Garden Theater before it, they're both designed by C. Howard Crane, who's definitely the most important architect we're going to talk about tonight, the most prolific of any of Detroit's theater architects. Well, I want to give you guys a closer look at its original appearance here because it's changed so much over the years. And those of you who have attended a show at the Majestic are like, that looks nothing like the theater that I attended. Well, the reason for that is that in the mid-1930s, the city of Detroit widened Woodward, and it forced a lot of businesses along Woodward to change the layout of their buildings. Some of them would cut off the front of the building and redesign inside. Some of them would actually lift the building and turn it 90 degrees to get more space. Well, the Majestic, it went through a huge redesign that the original architects were involved with, but it was spearheaded by Bennett and Straight, which is a pretty active firm at that time. And they produced a design that most of you are probably familiar with today. I took this shot just a couple summers ago. I really love this one, actually. When the Majestic Theater opens in 1915, its feature film is The Woman Who Dared, starring Francesca Bertini, who's an Italian silent legend. And this just gives you an idea of how deep and far back the history here goes, because we're still in an era of American history where you can be a film star even if you don't speak English, because everything you're saying in Italian just gets translated and put up as words on the screen. She's got a ton of film credits. My own personal experience here, I've seen quite a few concerts here. I've seen the Drive-By Truckers. I've been to a couple raves here, but I like to talk about this one, the time that I saw Jello Biafra give a spoken word performance. Who in the audience knows who Jello Biafra is? All right, so I know my friends know. Let's see, I'm gonna go with you because you may have actually seen Jello Biafra live. No?
Just got hit to the first Dead Kennedys record at Princeton.
All right.
What's up?
Jello Biafra was the lead singer for a punk band of the very late 70s and early 80s, known as the Dead Kennedys, who you've probably heard of before. And he was also very well known for his spoken word performances. I don't like the sound quality of the Majestic. I think that they gutted it too much to the point where it doesn't have the sound quality that it probably had in its early years. Go ahead.
Oh, and, well, I noticed I had the pleasure of being on stage because I was working with the band live there. And what I heard recently was, what I noticed on stage is instead of the ceiling going outward like that, it goes inward because it's been designed for people in the back looking at movies.
I gotcha.
And then they filled in the balcony. So it has a strange sound, at least outside, and also it seems wide.
Yes.
And so the sound kind of is weird in there, but it's a great place to see a show.
Well, as a person who's seen thousands of shows in Detroit, it's not one of my favorite venues. And I've seen a couple of bands that really liked it a lot that I considered the show disappointing. But Jello Biafra, spoken word, no problem. We're not nearly as worried about sound quality on it. I don't want to deter anyone from going to a show here, though. It's not going to be a horrible night for you, but I do think there's small theaters in Detroit that showcase significantly better sound than the Majestic. Moving on now to the Kaiser Blair building. This is right downtown in the commercial district where John R. meets Woodward. And you probably don't recognize it because this is yet another building that's gone through some changes over the years. When it's first built in 1915 as a 4-story building, Richard E. Raceman is the architect. In 1923, he's got a partner named Fryer, maybe Freer, and they add 4 more stories to it. And this is the second of the entries in my lecture that were not built as live performance venues, but would you believe that the basement of this place got used as a techno music club for probably close to a couple decades now? Its heyday was the first decade of the 2000s when clubs really replaced raves as the dominant way to see techno music in Detroit. But it continued on into the 2010s as whiskey disco. I'm not sure what it is right now, but in the first decade of the 2000s, this is one of the best clubs in town for techno music. I probably went to about 1/3 of these shows here. But my favorite examples of shows I went here are these 3. Carl Craig, he's the former director of Movement. He's one of Detroit's most important techno progenitors. Matthew Deere, he's like a 3rd or 4th wave techno creator that came to Detroit from Texas, and he's pretty world famous, but not like Lady Gaga world famous. Claude Monstrove is also known worldwide. He came from Detroit, but he didn't get famous until he moved out to the San Francisco area in California, and I saw him perform there in 2009. And one of the opening artists, Gabriel, he's one of my very best friends, actually. Orchestra Hall, easily one of the most important live music venues in Detroit's history. This is built in 1919, and these clippings give you an idea of how much the prospective design changed between the time it was first revealed to the public and when it got actually built. Changed a lot. The second rendering, it's significantly more utilitarian and modernized, I would say. And I love its look. Not quite as fancy as that first clipping. This is a photograph I made probably last summer, maybe the summer before that. Well, Orchestra Hall, when it Oh, I'm sorry, I fast forwarded a little bit too much. You can confirm the design origin here very easily by a collection of original drawings held by the Library of Congress, and at their website, there's about 25 drawings in this collection. When it first opens in 2019, it features 3 pianists, the most important of which is without question Osip Grbilowicz. Grbilowicz, he's actually the musical director for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra starting in 1919. And one of the reasons they built the theater was to entice Grbilowicz to come to town. There was a ton of new money in Detroit at this time. And a lot of people who held the money, they wanted to establish Detroit as an international place for music and give it a reputation overnight that it didn't have. But what's the best way to do that? Hire a musical conductor from Europe that's already wildly famous overseas. They gave him a ton of money. They gave him a ton of awesome contract stipulations. He was allowed to continue his career as a concert pianist. And he was also allowed to renew his contract on a year-by-year basis, which is pretty unique in these arrangements. So Grbilowicz coming to town is what gives DSO the reputation that it has to this day. And it is an internationally respected symphony. Interesting thing about Grbilowicz, he is married to the daughter of Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, and her name is Clara Clemens, and they lived together in Detroit for many years. If you go look into old ads, old directories to the city, you'll find their names quite easily. From what I understand, Clemens does have something to do with the marketing of Detroit to Grbilowicz, but I don't know the full story, so I don't want to get too deeply into it, but there's a lot of interesting history there if you care to look more deeply at it. When we talk about important histories of Orchestra Hall, this is probably one of the most important in all of Detroit history. The orchestra moves out of Orchestra Hall for quite a few decades in the middle of the 20th century. And from 1941 to 1951, it's run as the Paradise Theater, and it brings primarily the heavy hitters in jazz at the time, and it markets itself primarily to an African-American audience. And you can see from these ads, they are bringing the top people to town to be at one of these shows. Louis Armstrong, Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie in his very, very early days. I just can't even imagine how fantastic it would be. As far as my own experience here goes, I've volunteered with the DSO from 2018 to 2019, so I've seen a ton of shows here. My late wife, Carolyn Venegas Jones, introduced me to the DSO with a Home for the Holidays concert in about 2011, and I've been in love with the DSO ever since. If I can free up some time, I might volunteer for them again in the future. All right, now we're in Ferndale, our first example in Ferndale. And the Ferndale Theater, you guys probably know it better as the Magic Bag. This is built in 1921, and there's a very good circumstantial case for C. Howard Crane being the architect, but it's not as easily provable as most of his other designs. This is another one of my photographs I made last summer. Here's the earliest evidence we can find of the Ferndale Theater opening in 1921, but I've talked to a lot of historians in Ferndale about this building, and its early history is a little bit gray. Nobody knows exactly when it opened. One of the people I spoke to produced an ad for me from March of 1921, but I like this ad from April just a little bit better based on who they're playing at the theater this week. You can't really read it from that far away, but don't worry, I harvested some stuff from the internet so you can get a sense of who's playing at the Ferndale Theater in its first few months of being open. Buster Keaton, Tom Mix, Fatty Arbuckle, all massive stars. Pearl White, you might not remember her or know her name, but she was also a huge, huge star of her day. When I was preparing the the lecture, I actually watched Neighbors online. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. I laughed out loud many times. It's still super funny to this day. Through most of its life, the Ferndale Theater is a regular old film theater. And every ad you see here, except for the color Lon Chaney ad, is harvested from the Royal Daily Tribune. And you can see they're bringing the classics as well as the most famous people. Clark Gable, Claudine Colbert. I'm not sure. What's Colbert's first name? Does anybody know?
Claudine.
Claudine. Okay, I guess I did get it right. Claudette.
Claudette.
Is it Claudette? But this one I find really interesting. This isn't a very famous movie, but Bing Crosby's super famous. Jane Wyman, she's a former wife of Ronald Reagan. And Ethel Barrymore, she's in, Drew Barrymore's clan that have been in American screen and film for decades. There's also Wizard of Oz, of course, Roy Rogers, Gene Kelly, Joan Crawford. So really reputable theater, but as we move into the 60s, it decides it wants to be an art theater, and it opens up in 61. This is after a longtime owner has passed away. It reopens in 61 as an art theater, and its first film is by Ingmar Bergman, which I think most of us would agree is what is quintessentially thought of as an art film director. This streak lasts till 75, at which point they play their first rated X feature, and it lasts as an adult theater for about 13 years. And it doesn't seem to cause a lot of problems in the community, but when they decide to open a Deja Vu, it does. And Oakland County authorities, they take issue with it, and it's shut down within a couple of years. And it stays vacant until 1991, at which point it is reopened as the Magic Bag. And in its first year, it really concentrates heavily on jazz. So the first few months, it's mostly smaller names that you guys might not recognize. But as they get to the end of the first year, they start bringing in some heavy hitters. They get Leo Kottke, Maceo Parker. He's a former horn player in James Brown's band. And Max Roach, listed on the bottom of this one on the lower right. He's one of the most famous jazz drummers of all time. As far as my own experience at the Magic Bag, I've seen probably 5 or 6 shows here. Not too many are really wildly famous, but just a few years back, I saw late Elsa D, who was a competitor on The Voice in season 10. He's a native of Ann Arbor, and he's just a phenomenal live performer when he's fully electrified. This particular evening, it was an acoustic set, so it was much more subdued. I can't say I enjoyed it as much as when I saw him at Arts Pizza Needs, but he still is just, I mean, for somebody who looks like he just got done harvesting a field, he is just an insanely awesome guitarist. Highly recommend you guys try to see him sometime if you get the chance. He appeals to a really wide range of a listenership. Capitol Theater. This is downtown Detroit on Broadway. It's not called the Capitol Theater anymore, but when it opened in 1921, it was another C. Howard Crane design. And I hope you guys are noticing how many times his name comes up in this lecture, because he's so super important to Detroit's architectural legacy. The building has changed a lot over the years, to the point where the lower levels, they don't look a lot like they used to. But the upper levels, when you look up as you walk down the street, it has some really great architectural sculpture, and I'm a huge architectural sculpture fan. But these don't get a lot of notice because they're so high up and because the building has changed so much. So when you guys go downtown, try to get a better look at the top areas of this building that, well, I guess I should just tell you, it's now known as the Detroit Opera House. We'll get to that in a second, though. When it opens in 1922, the feature film is The Lotus Eater, featuring another Barrymore, John Barrymore, who's a legend of both screen and stage. He never wins a Best Actor award, but his stature is definitely worthy of it. He has a star on the Walk of Fame, and he's also the star of Grand Hotel, which wins Best Picture in 1932. Went backwards again. Sorry about that, folks. So the Capitol Theater went through quite a few. Thank you for coming tonight. It went through quite a few name changes over the years, and it didn't become the Detroit Opera House until 1996. And like a lot of downtown real estate, it definitely went through an era of being vacant. Let's talk about one other opening night. This is in 1934 when it reopens as the Broadway Capitol Theater, and the feature film this evening stars Marlene Dietrich, a name that probably everyone here has heard before. What you might not know about Marlene Dietrich is that she's a German national who denounced her German citizenship in the early years of World War II and became an American citizen. We're going to touch on Marlene Dietrich one more time in this lecture, so I want you to keep her name in mind. As far as my own experience here, I've been to, I want to say, 3 operas at the Detroit Opera House, all of which I enjoyed thoroughly. The interior decoration here is absolutely sumptuous and in great shape. But I want to mention that my favorite performance that I've seen here is a contemporary opera called The Summer King. And the main subject of this opera is a guy by the name of Josh Gibson, who was a Negro baseball player who a lot of people thought was going to cross the color line, but ended up not being the person. Jackie Robinson was. And this makes him both heroic and tragic, which is perfect for an opera. So if you guys ever get a chance to see The Summer King, highly, highly recommend it. I'm not a huge opera fan, but this definitely has become my favorite opera. What's that now?
Actually, some really good ballets.
Oh, okay, yeah, I've never seen a ballet there, but I imagine their setup works pretty well for it. This is the Francis Palms Office Building, better known as the State Theater, which has just recently, in the last few years, changed its name to the Fillmore Detroit. This is built in 1924 to 1925. Again, another C. Howard Crane design. And I put an article about Kunsky in here because Kunsky, he owns a ton of theaters in Detroit at this time. In fact, he's the city's top theater owner. We're going to look at a couple others that he owns at this time. This is my own photograph I made a couple summers ago. I love pointing out that this building has a cornerstone with Crane's name right on it if you go into the alley to the right there. And that's not a super common thing in Detroit, whereas it is in a lot of other major North American cities to put the architect's name right on a cornerstone. So I feel really lucky to have this one. I do a lot of studies in New Orleans too. Every significant construction gets the architect's name on the cornerstone. I wish that was the case in Detroit. When the State Theater opens in 1925, it features a film entitled Classified, starring Corinne Griffith. She's a pretty major star of her day. She's nominated for an Academy Award in 1929, but she never gets the Best Actress Award. She was also a phenomenal business person, and well, I don't like to cite Wikipedia too often, but according to Wikipedia, she left an estate worth 150 million at the time of her death, much later in the 20th century. In this building, it also goes through an era of being vacant in the 70s and the 80s, and it's reborn in 1989 as clubland. And you know, the modern concept of the club, it's, you know, it probably is born in the disco era, the way that we see it today. And this is kind of the dance vibe this guy seems to be shooting here for. But as we look at his lineup for the opening couple of years, well, only a few of them really fit into this club template. The Romantics, they're from Detroit. They did What I Like About You. It's not really club music. Joe Strummer, he's the guitarist for the Clash. Not really club music. Taylor Dane, she'll pass. Jackson Browne, Lawyers in Love, not club music. Grace Jones, she'll work for sure. Slayer, the super heavy metal speed band, not club music. You can see the rest of the list on the right. Jerry Seinfeld doesn't really fit with the formula, and neither does the Ramones. But nonetheless, this is a reusage of a formerly vacant building, and it ends up being continuously occupied after this reopening. So for that, we thank the redeveloper. I've seen a ton of concerts here. My first time ever coming to this theater was in 1994. I saw the heavy metal band from Texas, Pantera. And in 2001, I saw a famous local DJ named Jeff Mills, who was going by the moniker The Wizard at this time. But that's just a few of them. Just in the last 2 months, I saw an Italian hard rock band here called Måneskin. And I went with my friend Andy to see, what are they, Scottish? Welsh? Some UK punk band called Idols, and that was a really, really great show too. Still, in my opinion, one of the best venues to see a live show in Detroit. The Masonic Temple is one of the most important venues in Detroit's history, without a doubt. On its opening night in 1926, Grbilowicz, he opens the entertainment here. But we've already talked about Grbilowicz, and you already know who he is. So let's move on to Luella Melius. She's a soprano that is American. This is my own picture I took just a few months ago. I made this one. Melius is American, and in 1926, she seems pretty famous. She's getting talked about in the San Francisco Examiner, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Los Angeles Daily News. And I point this out because it's very, very uncommon for somebody to achieve this much notoriety in their lifetime, but be so unfamous by the time of their death that their death date is unknown to people who study her. So that's kind of an interesting story there. My favorite thing about the Masonic Temple, this is on a par with the live music that's happened here over the years, is the interior architectural embellishments, almost all of which were created by Corrado Carducci, the first guy that I wrote a book about. And he's probably got over 100 unique plaster designs here, also designs carved in stone and marble. Just keep in mind, if you're talking to your friends about it though, he's only got stuff on the inside. All the stuff on the outside is by different architectural sculptors. There's just a ton to observe and enjoy here. And I've had quite a few private tours thanks to some Masons that I know that run the place to this day. The Masonic Temple, it sticks with mostly what I'd call stuffy music through the 20s, 30s, 40s. You got something to say, Andy? I should.
The first time I went there, I saw the show Camelot.
Richard Harris. Wow, that sounds awesome, man. So Andy brings up an important point because the Masonic was also very famous through the 80s and 90s for Broadway stage shows. My parents saw Miss Saigon there. I think that Avita, I'm pretty sure, came through there when they did a traveling show. It's not doing those nearly as much. Fisher's more common for that these days. But that's a great first concert there. You got another one?
The last concert I saw there was Massive Attack there.
Ooh,
Massive Attack.
Massive Attack. I was supposed to go to that show with you and I got sick, if you remember correctly. Yeah. That show got postponed for about, was it a year, 2 years because of COVID? And then when it was finally time to go, I'm pretty sure I got sick and had to hand off my ticket to somebody else. Well, anyway, the Masonic Temple, it sticks to mostly stuffy music through the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. And by stuffy music, I mean stuff that I really love. There's a lot of classical, and a lot of big band type era stuff, but not like raucous rock concerts that most of us associate with popular music performance these days. Throughout the 60s, there's a slow transition to that at the Masonic. And I picked up 1974 because I feel like it's really the first year where they're fully engaged in presenting almost exclusively popular music. And the lineup they get this year, this is maybe a quarter of the ads I was able to hunt down for 1974. And I love how they opened the season with Diana Ross and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Interestingly, in the exact year that Motown moved from Detroit to Los Angeles. You look closely at this one, you'll see Queen and the Eagles. As a big fan of New Orleans, I love that Dr. John came to town. New Riders of the Purple Sage was a side act that Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead would play in eventually. I think we all know who Dolly Parton is. No explanation needed there. Eh? So just a phenomenal lineup in 1974 that I really enjoyed harvesting all these. Oops. Oh, I guess this thing's going back to working. Here's a lot of events that I attended personally. I've also seen Jack White's side act, The Rockin' Tours here. I've seen Mac DeMarco here. I've gone to a few raves here, and here's a few flyers from, I think I went to 4 of these 7 events here, but I just put up this collage to give you an idea of how much techno music was presented here in the first decade of the 21st century. Let's move on now to the Michigan Theater Building, and this is a building that is not used as a live music presentation space at all anymore. It is a parking ramp, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. When it opens up, let's talk about the architectural sculpture on the building first. I think it's one of the best examples in town, but unfortunately, this building is so blighted and so gritty with soot that it's easy to not notice this when you drive by or walk by it. But if you give it a really close look, it's definitely got some of the most interesting examples in downtown Detroit. When it opens in 1926, its feature film is You Never Know Women, starring Florence Vidor. That's that title, it's got a lot of wisdom in it, in my personal opinion. Florence Vidor, she's got a very great career of her own, but she's probably the most famous for her last name because she was married to King Vidor from 1915 to 1924. And King Vidor is a super influential Hollywood director from the very early years of Hollywood. A lot of people who study American cinema, they put him right below Cecil DeMille and D.W. Griffith in terms of the influence he exerted at this time. The Michigan Theater had an awesome live era during World War II. These are all taken from the Free Press from 1940 to 1945. Every one of these acts where you see an in-person preceding their name, it means they came to town. And most of them would give interviews to the local papers. You can find Groucho Marx comments about Detroit in the Free Press if you go looking far enough, and not surprisingly, they're pretty funny. I don't think Harpo said anything. You see this on? Go ahead, sir.
Wonder about segregation. Would there have been black and white audiences intermixed? Was it a certain night for black people?
That's a great question, and I can't shed any light on that one for you. But in my personal opinion, and I could be wrong with this, I would imagine that there was probably some level of de jure segregation that occurred, but I can't speak to it because I haven't studied it very thoroughly. I can tell you though that that kind of thing is not as pronounced. I spend a ton of time digging in old newspapers, and my main focuses are Detroit and New Orleans. And there's a huge contrast there because never in an old Detroit paper do you find an old article right next to an ad for a slave market, which I frequently run into in my studies. So the racial issue doesn't get spoken to as much in Detroit papers on this era, where it's really just blatant in New Orleans because it's such an accepted part of their culture. So I can't shed any light on that, but that would be a very interesting subject to study. Just a few names I want to mention that came to town in person. Jimmy Dorsey and his brother Tommy Dorsey, famous horn players. Glenn Miller, and just in case any of you don't have great vision, we've got Bob Hope here, wildly famous. Benny Goodman, Buddy Epson right here, and Abbott and Costello right here. Martha Ray's also kind of an interesting draw. I only remember her from disc detergent commercials because I really don't even know what she was famous for, to tell you the truth. I'm guessing she was a Hollywood star.
She was a comedian.
A comedian, okay.
She did movies with Bob Hope.
Okay, great, all right. Well, the most famous uses of the Michigan Theater in the modern era is without question its appearance in the Academy Award-winning film 8 Mile, starring our local legend Eminem. And in this movie, Eminem and his friends at the time, they have rap battles inside the Michigan Theater. From what I've heard from a lot of my friends, this is actual era that happened here. I was really the techno music at this time, and if I wasn't, I might have gotten lucky enough to go to a few of these rap battles at this parking ramp, but I didn't. But it's really awesomely recreated for the movie, in my opinion. I'm a big fan of this movie, mostly because it's not about getting famous. It's about overcoming stage fright. Let's move into Oakland County again, Royal Oak Music Theater. You'll note this is another Comsteon theater, the powerful theater owner at this time. If we take a really close look at the marquee as it's portrayed in the Daily Tribune in 1928, we can see that it's lost quite a bit of its architectural decoration, which is kind of unfortunate. But it's still, even with the pediment lost at the top there, it's still one of the more architecturally intriguing buildings in downtown Royal Oak, and we still have quite a bit of detail left over. If you look closely, you'll see that this building is connected to the Washington Square building, which is one of the most prominent constructions in downtown Royal Oak, but that's not designed by Rapp and Rapp. Rapp and Rapp are a Chicago firm. And in my opinion, because these buildings are so stylistically similar, it's almost a certainty that Rapp and Rapp conferenced with Frederick Madison one or two times to make sure they weren't designing architecturally incongruous buildings. Frederick B. Madison, he's really important to Royal Oak's history and probably the most notable architect to ever come out of that city. When the Royal Oak Theater opens in 1928, it's a feature film by the name of Sporting Goods, starring Richard Dix, another massively famous star that probably is not as well known in the modern age as he ought to be. He was nominated for Best Actor, and he also was the starring role in Cimarron, which won the Best Picture in 1931. Whoops, I went backwards again. I'm going to try to stop doing that. Here's one of my, so the Royal Oak Music Theater, it starts flirting with live music performance in the 70s. And we're going to cover just 3 events here that happened in the 70s. And this was probably my favorite discovery here. Does anybody know who the Runaways are? Yes, okay, you guys are old rockers back there. I love it. So the Runaways were a rock band whose lead singer was Joan Jett, who, you know, not Jukebox Hero. What was the name of her big hit? Jukebox here.
Well, I love rock and roll.
I love rock and roll, exactly. Saw him standing there by the record machine. So her first foray in big time music was with the group The Runaways. Lita Ford was also in this group, and they got a ton of support from their label in '77. They sent them out on a national tour, and look who's opening for them. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Since when does Tom Petty open for Joan Jett? Well, in 1977 he does, and this is about maybe 1 month after Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers write American Girl, which I just think this is just an awesome timepiece this ad I found here. Cheap Trick right in the middle. So that's not the one that was $5. We're gonna come up with another lineup like that in a second here that has a lineup as impressive for only $5. In 1978, jazz quartet comes through, and these guys don't get a lot of press in the annals of jazz music, but for a couple of years they toured as a quartet, and all four of these guys here, every one of them is considered legendary at the instrument he performs on in jazz circles. Ron Carter actually came from Ferndale originally, but he didn't really get noted as a bass player until later in his life. Last one I want to touch on here is from 1979, Hall & Oates. Can I assume everybody here has heard of Hall & Oates? You gotta love John Oates' confidence. Let's show up shirtless in all of our publicity photos. Looking good there, John. So these guys are, what's that?
I've seen all of.
All right, great. Where was that at? In Michigan?
Yes, it was at a casino in Detroit in like 2011, 2010. It was at,
That sounds pretty promising. Motor City probably.
it was my bachelorette party at Motor City.
Well, now it
It
sounds
was
really
on fire.
promising.
Yeah, they sounded just as good. They were great.
That sounds great. I've seen quite a few live videos. Daryl Hall is a pretty great live singer, even in his old age. So they're kind of famous at this point, but they're not wildly famous like they get in the 80s. And that's why they're playing the Royal Music Theater instead of, say, Cobo Hall, for example. And this is just one more notable concert that when I came across the old clippings in the paper, I was just like, wow, that is so great. They played a small club right in our area. As far as my own experience here goes, I've gone to probably 4 concerts here. This is not one of my favorite local venues, to tell you the truth, but I definitely have seen some notables. I lost my Sonic Youth ticket somewhere along the way, my ticket stub, but I still have my ticket stub from Blues Traveler in 2002. And my friend Andy, again, he attended the Sturgill Simpson concert there with me in 2016, and that was really great. He was touring with a horn section made mostly of New Orleans horn players at that time. And he's a country artist, so that's kind of a little bit weird that people thought it was a little bit weird that he was doing that. All right, the Fox Theater, go ahead.
Oh, I have a story about the Royal Music Theater. So
Yeah.
back, I don't know, did it used to be a club?
I don't know the era, but it wouldn't surprise me if they forayed into that once or twice.
Well, according to my parents, it used to be a club. And one night when they were there was a fight that happened. And coincidentally, my dad had just gotten out of the Navy at this time. So he was like big and he also had like a buzz cut. He looked like a tough guy, right? So anyway, so as this was happening, he walked outside and my mom was inside and the police were coming and my dad like immediately like gets tackled by a cop because I think that he's the one who started the fight.
That's a great story.
Yeah, he didn't do anything according to my parents, but yeah.
I
So
got
my dad
tackled by the police for doing nothing.
yes, outside.
Well, that's a fun one to retell. I'm glad that it was just a tackle.
Yeah.
The Fox Theater, another venue that I'm guessing everybody here is, everybody's heard of. This is pretty much Crane's local apotheosis as far as theater design goes, and it just got a ton of press over the course of the couple of years. It was built in 1927 and 1928. These are my own personal photographs I made a couple summers ago. I really love this image here I got of the neon, but I'm telling you from experience, trying to photograph it numerous times, you never get it with all the neon on, no matter how often you go looking for it. They've always got 1 or 2 that are out for some reason. When it opens in 1928, its feature film is Street Angel, starring Janet Gaynor, another massively famous star of her time. Janet Gaynor is nominated for the Academy Award in 1929 based on her appearance in 3 films, which is kind of unique. They don't really do it that way anymore. But she ends up winning the award in one of the 3 films she's recognized for is Street Angel. As far as my own experience here goes, I've seen quite a few concerts here. I've seen Lenny Kravitz here. I've seen Beck here. But the one I like to talk about is The Lonely Island featuring Andy Samberg. This is a comedy parody band. And I'll leave it to your own devices to discover what their music is like when you get home tonight. Let's talk about C. Howard Crane for just a second, because he gets mentioned probably in 7 of our venues here. And he's definitely the most important theater designer of Detroit's, classic theater era, the 20s and 30s. And he also designs all over the United States. The American Insurance Union building is just an unbelievably beautiful skyscraper in downtown Columbus. The United Artists Theaters, he designs one in Detroit, in addition to the one that just got torn down in downtown Detroit. Fox Theater, that's very stylistically similar to our Fox Theater, is in close to downtown St. Louis. And he's also active in London after the 30s. He moves to London and he designs the Earl's Court Exhibition Center that was demolished in 2017, but it served as a massive concert venue for many decades. And he's also instrumental in the rebuilding of London in the post-war years. Just look at a couple of his examples from outside of Detroit. This is the United Artists Theater in Los Angeles. This is my own photograph. Crane most likely did not design the architectural sculpture, but he most likely conferenced with the person who did. And the Fox Theater in St. Louis exhibits some of the same architectural exuberance that we see in the Fox Theater here in Detroit. The Grande Ballroom. Who's heard of the Grande Ballroom? Who's been to a show at the Grande Ballroom? I didn't get a hand over here. Did I get one over here? Oh, not a single Grande Ballroom veteran here. What's that now?
Way too young.
You're too young. All right. Well, fair enough. Fair enough. The Grande Ballroom is built in 29, and I don't talk much about its opening years because the Grande Ballroom is without question considered one of the most famous venues in the United States for showcasing what was considered countercultural music in the late 70s and early 70s, but now is an absolute mainstay of our culture. And pretty much using most of the bands in that classic rock vein are pretty much universally liked by Americans. So let's look at a few people who played here over the years. We've got the Dead. Eric Clapton comes through with his band Cream so early that the press is still referring to them as the Cream, which I think is awfully interesting. If you look at the top left there, you'll see that Jimmy Page has a new band, and they're called Led Zeppelin. They're coming to town. This is Led Zeppelin's first American tour, so that's just absolutely legendary. I really like this one in the middle on the far right, the Jeff Beck Group. They're coming to town tonight, and they're bringing a bass player named Ron Wood, who goes on to play guitar for the Rolling Stones for over a couple decades. And they've also got an unknown new vocalist was in that night. His name is Rod Stewart. So that's probably Rod Stewart's first visit to Detroit, I would imagine. Also, always have to know the MC5, who are probably the most legendary live performers from Detroit during this era that are performing rock and roll. We don't want to discount what Motown's doing. These are my own personal photographs, again, taken recently. Unfortunately, the Grande's been vacant for quite a few years, and it doesn't look like there's any redevelopment plans on the horizon. So this one's probably going to get torn down eventually, even though it's on the National Register of Historic Places.
Doesn't the church own it?
I don't know anything about its ownership records.
On that block,
I did see a for sale sign on it recently, though.
yeah, and they were asking like way too much.
That doesn't surprise me one bit. It's got the history attached to it. People think that's worth a premium. Well, it is if your building's in an economically viable neighborhood.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, I love Detroit, even the most blighted neighborhoods that don't mind walking around them a bit. But we have to consider the reality. Can this building really be sustained in this neighborhood by what is happening economically? And I'm afraid in that neighborhood, the answer is most likely no. I fast forwarded too far. Easttown Theater's got a very similar history to the Grande Ballroom. It is attracting the exact same kind of counter. You've been to, tell me about your experience at the Easttown.
It was great. And the only reason I didn't go to Grande because my mother was dissuading me from this lifestyle. That day, I was supposed to be somewhere else, but we went, my friend and I went to the Easttown. It was a great light show. It was like what the Grande was.
Do you remember the band?
No, I
No?
don't think I even cared. I was just so loud.
That's great, fantastic. All right, thank you for sharing. The East Town, it got torn down in 2015 after it had a massive fire. And this is another example where you can see how much the design changed between the time it's first revealed to the public and the time that it actually gets built. When it opens in 1931, it has a feature film starring a name that I'm pretty sure everyone here knows, Clark Gable. He's pretty much the top spokesperson for pomade in the company's history. I actually don't know if he ever did any pomade ads, but he should have. Gable wins the Best Actor in 1934, and he's pretty much a household name to this day. East Town Theater's got some more great history of who shows up in the late 60s and early 70s. Steve Miller Band, Sly and the Family Stone, Jefferson Airplane, Fleetwood Mac. Chuck Berry's kind of a little, doesn't really fit into this kind of stuff perfectly, but I'm sure he got a good attendance that night. This one right here is my favorite though. Fleetwood Mac, Sir Lord Baltimore, and Black Sabbath, all on the same night, $5. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sir Lord Baltimore, but they're a hard rock band from New York at the time who were pretty successful, but obviously not as successful as Fleetwood Mac or Black Sabbath. And here's, I actually got some shots of this, and this is in the era before I became a pro photographer. I shot these with that little Kodak I showed you earlier in the lecture, because I had gotten wind of the fact that there was a fire here and knew that I needed to get out there if I wanted to get any architectural detail before they finished tearing it down. Similar part of town here, if I'm not mistaken, the Harper Theater. Anybody been to a show at Harpo's?
Amazing.
Okay,
Go ahead.
let's go with all of them. What have you seen?
The most, I saw Steve Marriott there from the Small Faces.
Okay,
And then Humble Pie.
nice.
He was there and he died shortly after that.
I see it.
But there was a guitar, Detroit guitar. Kind of,
Like a competition, like a battle of the bands?
it wasn't even that. It was, they were like famous guitar players and they were playing there one night. And they also, because of the roughness of the neighborhood, would have employees with dogs take women to their.
Wow. All right. Yes. How is there?
So here's the flip side of rock and roll store. So as a kid, I saw movies there.
Okay.
And it had a great entrance. Very interesting. But then you go behind the doors and then you be in the theater. But so here I am, 18 in the summer of '76, and as an 18-year-old, it was legal to drive and drink. So a friend of mine who is the cool guy in the group had a Trans Am with a big bird on it.
He does sound cool.
And he had the disco book going. It was 1976. This was the first place in Michigan that had an electric dance floor.
Okay, yeah, I read about that era in the paper. I didn't want to include it in the lecture here, but I do.
Yeah.
I did read some articles about its club era.
So here we are, four 18-year-olds piling into this car. We go to this place. We're the youngest ones in there. I had never done any drinking before.
Nice. Well, that's really involved for sure.
But it was really cool to see. And everybody looked like, Saturday Night Fever.
I gotcha.
It was full on there.
That sounds great. I'm a little bit jealous, because I mean, I love the rave scene in Detroit in the 90s, but it doesn't have a lot of the same proclivities as that disco era had. But it did, house music and techno, they did technically grow out of disco.
Oh, absolutely.
When disco went into it lost its popularity in the late 70s. It really started to get central around New York and Chicago, and a lot of those artists were forced into their homes to make the music rather than and that's where we get the term house music, or at least that's the most plausible explanation for the term house music, because a lot of those people who were making dance music in the late 70s, they were forced into their homes to make the music, and they started calling it house music. So anyway, let's move on with Harper Theater. It eventually becomes known as Harpo's. When it opens in '39, it features a film called The Rains Came with Myrna Loy and Tyrone Power. Neither won Best Picture, but both of them are just short of that stature, and both of them were pretty big stars of their time. They both have stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. I just want to throw in one more picture, because when I shot this earlier this summer, I just got perfect light that night. I really love the photographs I made. For my own experience here, oh, I'm sorry, you guys didn't tell your Harpo story. Go
He
ahead.
just wants to tell you.
I saw Slayer.
Nice, nice. All right, that sounds
I
great.
remember the floor, but it wasn't Flint. It was-
This is after the Live Floor era. That's like late seventies, early eighties, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
76 for the two body, two.
Okay. Did somebody else have a Harpo story that I missed? Did you have a Harpo story, Amanda?
I know that I've been there, but I was on too many drugs to.
Thank you for your honesty.
I mean, it was like, it's that era, Dale.
It
You know what
was.
I'm talking about.
I do.
wasn't trying.
Well, I've
It
seen
was like the
Guar.
late 90s. I don't know, but I know.
Anybody who's seen Guar isn't gonna judge you for what you did. Amanda. Does anybody know who Guar is?
rules.
I just love how that ticket says all ages welcome and it's a Guar show.
Yeah, okay, so Guar has taken the concept of shock rock and taken it to its most ridiculous extreme. And it's not for everyone, but, I loved the good times I had at the show. At the time, I was dating a really super interesting woman who loved Guar, and Guar makes a mess of their audience with all their stage show and things that they squirt out of the audience. She came home completely soiled. Well, I stayed in the background and came home completely clean. Let's talk about Charles and Agri. He was the designer of the Grande Ballroom and Harpo's. I think I have one other theater in here that he designed. And he's a great contributor to Detroit's architectural legacy through this era. And even earlier, he designs the Whittier Hotel that's down by Indian Village, but closer to the river on the other side of Jefferson. The Bellcrest Hotel is right in the Wayne State University area of campus. And his son Arnold goes on to lead the successor firm that designs the Pontiac Tel 12 and Oakland malls and a few other large shopping centers locally. Let's just get a good look at what's more typical of Agri's work. This is the Greater Whittier Apartments. They're added to the Greater Whittier Hotel a few years after it's first built. And then on the Wayne State University campus, as I was saying, the Bellcrest Hotel that is significantly less posh today than when it was opened in the 1920s. It was considered a pretty fancy destination at that point.
No.
We're getting close to the end here, folks. Telenews Theater. So this guy back here who's actually seen a film at Harpo's, I wonder if you're old enough to have seen a newsreel at Telenews.
No.
No, okay. Well, this opens it continues into the 60s, and that's the only reason I'm asking.
Yeah.
And I'm not old enough to see anything in the 60s, and you probably aren't either, but maybe just old enough to see.
I never went there,
Okay.
so I couldn't, that's a really.
Saw the Misfits at Harpo's. Nice. That's a great addition to the chat there. Excellent. So the Telenos Theater, it's built as a newsreel theater. And this used to be a common thing in the United States, theaters that only play news. And it's open right at the, as the US gets involved in World War II. So we follow their weekly ads in the Free Press. We can loosely follow almost the entire history of World War II here. I actually have a friend on the Berkeley Historical Committee. When I first showed him this picture of this history I discovered, he's like, I saw a newsreel there in the 60s. I used to go all the time. I was like, you're really dating yourself, Jeffrey, but I was fascinated that I knew somebody who knew it as a newsreel theater, because I only know it as Blue Nightclub, and it's been running as Blue since about 2000, I want to say. And they've been the more commercial end of the techno scene in Detroit, and they've been a real mainstay. I went to every one of these shows that you see listed here. This one's extra special to me here because this one, I picked Cascade up at the airport and dropped him off at the club that night because my friend Gabe promoted the show. So I've had a lot of great experiences at Blue over the years. All right, so we're about to finish up here with two really big ones in Oakland County. The Pontiac Silverdome, I'm positive you're all familiar with. It opened up as Pontiac Municipal Stadium in 1975, and they opened with an exhibition win versus the Kansas City Chiefs. And these are some of the first Lions names that I ever learned as a kid growing up in Traverse City, Dexter Bussey especially. So I really loved who played there that night. Well, the critics aren't crazy about it. Oh, go ahead.
I was there. I
Which
was
one?
gonna say, I was at that show.
The who?
Yeah.
Nice. Well, the critics aren't crazy about these big, huge early shows that happened in the Silverdome in the early 70s because it's a huge cave and it's not built for acoustics. And a lot of people who think deeply about music criticism, they're kind of offended that they see this as kind of a money grab. General public loves it though, and that's why we break records with these shows. And a lot of people, you know, they're here because they want to see their heroes more than they want to hear perfect acoustics, or they just don't know what perfect acoustics is supposed to sound like. Who gets 75,000 in 1975? Elvis does a New Year's Eve show in 75 that 65,000 attend. I do have one friend in the Berkeley Historical Committee who attended this show. The press is aware of the fact, oh, I'm getting really late, I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm almost done. That it's just not the same flashy Elvis. This is probably less than a year before he passes away, if I'm not mistaken. So we can tell that he's quite a bit rounder in the face here. And the most record-breaking concert to take place here is, of course, Led Zeppelin in 1977, and this gets press a lot in Detroit, but even in other cities are covering this concert because it's such a massive crowd for a single performance. As far as my own experience here, my dad had club level tickets here throughout the 1990s. I saw Barry Sanders break 2,000 yards in the season here. I saw Mike Utley get paralyzed here. I saw Reggie Brown's career end here, and I saw the Lions' only playoff win since the 1950s here. All of that happened in the 1990s. Reggie Brown's injury might have been in the 2000s. Actually, Barry topping 2,000 yards might have been in the 2000s also. Not only have I been to a bunch of Lions game here, in 1984, my dad took me here for a Pistons game before they started playing at the Palace, and they would rearrange the seating inside. But it really wasn't the greatest venue for watching basketball. What was? The Palace of Auburn Hills. I've seen so many great performances here in both basketball and music. I've really missed this venue, and I think it's kind of a loss for the Detroit metro area that it was torn down prematurely. Much like the Silver Dome, the Palace of Auburn Hills is designed by a local firm, Rossetti Architects, based in Southfield. I didn't really mention the architects in the last one, and I should. Odell, Hewlett, and Lukenbach, who were really important in Detroit throughout the 1970s, probably the most important era. Odell, he's dead by that point, but he's the most important part as far as Detroit architectural legacy goes, because history goes all the way back to the 1910s, maybe even the first decade of the 1900s. But anyway, let's talk more about the Palace. I'm not sure why I start with my experience here. Oh, I do know why I do, because I like to triumphantly end with the first week that happened there. But I've seen the Grateful Dead here 3 times, seen Marilyn Manson once. At the December 2nd, 1999 show, Fish, I was having a great time until somebody jumped off the second level, which is the only time I've ever seen anything like that happen at a concert. It really ruined everybody's good time in the section we were in. Crosby, Stills, and Nash in 2000. So I was not good at photography during these years, and that's why you don't see any photographs. But by the time I saw Adam Lambert with Queen here in 2017, I'd gotten pretty good, and I got really good seats that night, so I was able to make not necessarily professional photographs, but pretty good for an amateur, if you ask me. The Palace's opening week is phenomenal. We start off with Sting on the first night. David Lee Roth, this is probably his first, maybe second tour after leaving Van Halen. Randy Macho Man Savage, I'm guessing there's not that many pro wrestling fans in this audience, but you never know. Pink Floyd plays 2 nights in a row. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, this is years before I saw them. We get a little bit of country flavor with Randy Travis and the Judds. And then on the 8th night, we get Judas Priest with special guest Cinderella. On the 8th night, we get a team of NBA stars playing an exhibition against the United States Olympic team. And this is the last Olympic team that uses amateurs instead of pros. So one of the guys that ends up playing that night is Dan Marley, who I watched play in high school in Traverse City and is my all-time favorite basketball player. I believe the NBA stars won on this evening, and I think that the U.S. team went on to get bronze that year, if I'm not mistaken. Toyed with the idea of touching on the 10th night here, but it was Bill Cosby, so I decided to leave it out. And we all know how the first season of the Palace opening ended up. The Pistons, they go on to the best record in the NBA, sweep the Lakers in the finals to win their first championship. Joe Dumars is the MVP. He goes on to be the general manager of the Pistons, and they repeat again the next year. And that is the triumphant closing of my lecture, folks. I hope you've enjoyed what you've listened to tonight. And if you're intrigued by any of it, I'd love to sell you one of my books or one of my photography prints. If you have any spare cash to go around this evening. Thank you so much. That comes to Q&A, but it looks like we're about 10 minutes from closing up, folks. So if anybody has any questions, take them as quick as I can.
You mentioned the Pistons, what about Kobo?
Kobo is a venue that I have in another incorporation of this lecture. I try to change it up from venue to venue so people aren't seeing the exact same
Sure.
thing. And when I lecture in Oakland County, I try to get a little bit more of an Oakland County bent. But Kobo is definitely an important venue in Detroit's past.
Olympia?
What's that?
Olympia.
Olympia is another one. I haven't actually added a section for that yet, but there's definitely enough press in the local papers that I can get slanty and look at the harvest for Olympia. And I almost certainly will have that at some point.
What about Joe?
The Joe Louis Arena? I've never seen a concert at the Joe. Do you guys know if they host
They
concerts
do,
in the
yeah.
past?
I think Drake came
Drake?
to the Joe.
Well, that's a big
like
name.
2018.
You know, I seem to remember
Occasionally.
maybe they did a few raves, really big commercial, like mainstream raves there in the 90s also. And I hadn't really thought about them as a live venue, but historically, it's really important to Detroit. I think I'll look at
My-
Yeah.
A lot of the big names like
I'm sorry, Andy, you said it was play there, you saw him play there? Okay, so apparently it's true.
You had that show?
they had a lot of things, Rush and Van Halen, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they had, I think it held about 40,000.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that. I never looked into the Joe Louis. as a
My
live
dad
band.
says.
I
Drake
agree with
is
you
very
about that.
You should tell them that, right?
I know, I should.
That's the coolest thing about this house.
Get on the-
Normally, venues have huge, it's hard.
You gotta join the
It's
song.
hard.
I know.
Some bands just can't play it small venues. Yeah, so the acoustics in there were rendered beautifully. I was very
So you go there with
Easy to get in, get out.
You're just not.
I agree, I agree.
I want to throw out that the folks online say Clutch Cargo's in Pontiac,
Yeah.
Redford Theater, and the Fisher.
Yes, all venues completely worthy of being included. And like I was saying, I do have multiple versions of this lecture that I produced for different area historical societies and libraries that would like to see it. The Redford Theater, I have not studied up on, but what was the other one he mentioned? There was one, Clutch Cargo's in Pontiac. That's
Yes.
a great example because
Legendary.
Clutch Cargo's, it started out as a church, then it got converted to a concert venue, and it's been reconverted back to a church in the present day. But at Clutch Cargo's, I saw, has anybody heard of Air? They were really popular in the 2000s. I saw Air there. And, there was one, I saw Portishead there.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
my son's been there
On their
too.
second tour, on their second American tour, and that was
We must
great.
have been at the same time.
We
We saw
might,
Stereo Lab together.
I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous. So for the online commenters that feel that the omission is glaring, don't feel that it's omitted, just that it didn't make it into this particular version of the lecture. It probably will be added to some other versions. Any other online comments?
No, just thank you and wonderful photographs and informative presentations.
Thanks
Which
so much.
I
for
would like to
having me.
thank. Shut down and start packing up, but feel free to chat with people. We have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, folks. Hey, John, good to see you again. Thanks for coming out, man. I enjoyed that.
See, it looks like an owl and it's called an owl. It's meta.